Bill Johnson here with another Carbon Cub maintenance moment. Today I'm going to illustrate how I cover an elevator. But before doing that, for those that are not familiar with small airplanes and the covering process, the fabric is a polyester-based fabric that you put over the structure, and this is a wing. And you glue that fabric onto the structure and then shrink it with an iron. So I was showing you in a minute, here are some finished ones, but even the fuselage will have fabric covering over the fuselage when it is done. And this is a common technique for airplanes that dates back a very long time to the earliest days of aviation. In the early days, they used a fabric called grade A cotton, but today it's a polyester-based fabric. And this is how it looks after having glued the fabric onto some control surfaces. And you use the iron and shrink it. It's very tight. I have the rudder done, and I have one of the elevators back there done. So the rudder is the hardest piece in my view to cover, because unlike most of the control surfaces, like the horizontal stabilizer, which goes onto the tail of the plane, and you have the elevator that goes up and down, the stabilizer just is a permanently fixed position, and the rudder goes here. So unlike many of the control surfaces where you can wrap the fabric around to the bottom side and cover that seam, the rudder is vertical and you see both sides of the rudder. And I'll show you in a minute how these envelopes are made, but there's a seam here on the rudder, and because you can see both sides, when you shrink, you try to get that seam perfectly aligned on that backbone. And if you do it well, you can see that the seam follows the backbone very well. On the elevators, I try to get the seam put on the bottom of the elevator so that you don't have to follow that backbone around. Here's an uncovered elevator. I showed you the covered elevator over there. So today we're going to walk through the process of getting this elevator covered and shrank, basically gluing the fabric on there and shrinking the fabric. And there's more to the process. As you saw on the wings, there's a pinkish color called polybrush that you put on, and there's a series of tapes you put on any place that has a sharp edge. So there's much more to the process, but today, and one of the more difficult steps of the process, is to get the fabric on there neatly, shrink it at 2 different temperatures, and prepare it for the next step. So we will go through that today here using this elevator. The system we're using is called polyfiber, and it's a polyester fabric and a vinyl coating system. And to get more details, you can review this book, but I'm going to walk through the process of getting the fabric glued onto the structure. There are several steps to the process. There's a lot of stuff in the book. But today we're going to do step 1, glue the fabric onto the elevator, and then use our iron to shrink that fabric and make it very tight and taut. All right, the first thing I'm going to do is take a Brillo pad, and we're going to rough up the surfaces just a little bit so that the glue will stick very well to the primer that will be under the fabric. The other reason to do this is that any place that's going to have paint, like this hinge, the fabric will go around that hinge and there will be paint on that. So another reason to scuff that up a little bit.
The fabric will primarily glue here and down this backbone. So I want to make sure that sticks very well in those areas.
The next thing I would do is take some reducer and just clean everything well. since you won't be able to get to it once the fabric is on there. Any dust or dirt that's on there I want to get off.
Now it's important to know the top, which side's the top.
And which side is the bottom. In this case, the longer part of the arm is the top. So this is the top of the elevator. Get the fabric envelope out. I can tell that it goes on this way because of that sharp angle. So when I say envelope, you can see the elevator slides in between there. You can see there's a sewn seam. And again, we want that sewn seam to be on the bottom, which be on the other side. So I'm going to put the envelope on like so. And you'll see me struggle for a couple of minutes here as I try to get this elevator inside this envelope.
It's pretty snug.
And you can see again, this is the top, which is the long part of the arm. And you can see already that the seam is mostly along the bottom. And we'll fine tune that as we go. Again, on the rudder, you need to be right on the backbone because you see both sides. But since that is the bottom of the elevator, it's not something you will ordinarily see. Okay. Next thing I'm going to do is cut away some of this fabric. We need to have a 45 back into this corner. And that helps to relieve some of the tension and also helps you to get a better fit. I'm not going to go all the way in there yet. For anybody who's not familiar, these are Fisker pinking shears, and you need to use the Fisker brand. The other brands will not stay sharp and will dull very quickly cutting this fabric. Of a little bit of this excess fabric. Although I'm cutting away the excess, there is still plenty of fabric which will wrap around that tube. only purpose there is just to get rid of some of the excess, make it a little easier to handle. Okay, so this is the top. So you want this seam that wraps around this tube to be on the bottom when you're done without any seams on the top. So if we start with the bottom and wrap it around the tube, cut it off, and then put this over that and wrap it to the bottom, you will not have a seam on the top that would be visible. You are going to put tapes over that, but it's still a good idea to start with the bottom and fold it up around and then do the top last. So let's turn this over. And we will start with the bottom. So eventually you're going to glue the fabric to this backbone of the elevator, and here will be the where the fabric glues. You do not need to put any glue along this back seam, and actually it's better that you don't, so that as you shrink the fabric it can move slightly and you can make sure you get things lined up the way you want. So I would not put any glue on the back where that stitching is. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is trim a little bit of this excess fabric away. And we're going to want to glue, well, I'm going to trim this excess fabric away, and I'm going to take this 45 all the way up into this corner, so that'll fold down neatly. I'm going to put a mark just before the corner. Sharpies really aren't good to be used on fabric, but that's going to be cut away. So I'm going to extend this cut, this relief cut, all the way up into the corner. There we go. That way that fabric will fold down. Use a bag here to hold. That fabric will fold down like that, and this one will fold down like so. I'm also going to remove this excess fabric here. It's just not needed in the way. Now this process is very similar on the rudder as well. Again, on the rudder you want to make sure that seam is on the actual edge versus underneath the control surface. So now I'm going to pull that tight before I put any glue on it, just to see how it's going to lay. That looks like it'll lay very nice. Even without shrinking, that fabric's pretty tight. So we're going to go ahead and glue that. Actually, before I glue that, I'm going to go ahead and cut this relief in the bottom part as well. Okay. Carefully apply glue. You want to try to avoid getting it on that bottom piece because we don't want to glue that yet. We'll take and pull it tight. Work some of that glue into the fabric. And ideally, you want to see the black structures showing through just a little bit. That tells you that the glue has penetrated through this fabric very well. bit of time for that glue to dry. And I don't know if you can see, there's hinge points here and a hinge point here. We want to make a notch in the fabric for those hinges to come through. So I cut it with a razor blade, and the fabric cuts much easier if you use a little bit of glue. It won't fray on you. So I put just a circular spot of glue over those hinge points. I also put some glue down in here to keep all this from fraying. Primarily, it makes it easier to cut here in the future. Okay. We're going to let that set up. Then we're going to cut out those holes for the hinges. Glue's still a little bit wet. Has dried around these hinges, so now I'm going to take a pencil. I'm going to feel for the hinges. I'm going to mark so I just made a little mark where that hinge is. Take a very sharp razor blade. Make sure you use fresh razor blades for some of this, because again, this fabric dulls these blades very quickly. Actually, that one is already too dull. So buy you a package of 100 razor blades and use them. I don't know if you can see or hear how much easier that cut. And then if you do that well, you'll see that it'll just kind of pop right down and around there. I'll give you a close-up picture here so you can see. See how it just formed right around that? Of course, that's going to wrap back up under the tube. And I'll do the same thing to this one. Again, you have to feel for it and then take your pencil and draw out where you need to cut. Sometimes the glue gets on the lead and it doesn't want to write very well. Okay, now when I pull down the fabric, it looks good. Okay, now we're going to apply some glue. Pull that back off. Pull that back off. We're going to apply glue down this bar so that fabric will glue on. Okay. Flap it over the hinges and then just give it a good, get it good and tight. Again, you want to see that glue forced through that fabric. Just forcing a little bit more glue through the fabric. You got to do this quickly before that glue dries underneath. Okay. Now I'm not using any gloves, but it's just glue and it'll peel off your hands. And with gloves on, I lose kind of the feel that I like to have. Now this piece of fabric will wrap in and around, so I'm going to again cut just a little bit off of there, because I know I don't need that much. Okay. And then once that wraps into there, this will come around there. Again, that'll put the final seam on the bottom. Once this sets up good, we're going to turn this over. Bag just helps make sure it doesn't, that kind of bean bag, make sure it doesn't fall off the table here. And now, I think I'm gonna have to move the camera so you can see a little better. Oh, well, that one wasn't good. I'm not a very good filmmaker, but hopefully you'll get the idea. Of course, it's not costing you anything to watch the video, so. So there's two pieces here. This is the piece we're going to fold in and under like that. I'll trim a little of that corner off there. We're going to glue it on the lip right here. good. Okay, we're going to let that dry, and then we're going to take a razor blade and we're going to cut the excess material off the back. Once that dries. Now this is tricky because you want to use your razor blade, very sharp again, but you don't want to cut this piece of fabric. So I'm not sure how you'll be able to see this. Okay, be very careful so you don't cut that outer piece. Okay, we'll glue that here in a minute. Wish I could show you a better angle, but let's try this. Maybe this works better. I don't know. This piece of fabric will fold up, so I'm going to make a line because I need to cut it off. don't know, you won't be able to see this very well, but I'm going to cut down that line. And be careful you don't cut the piece of fabric behind there. Now, instead of applying glue to the bar, I'm going to apply glue to the fabric. Primarily because if you try to do the bar, it'll make a mess, and you may not have enough glue on there to get all of the fabric. So we're going to put the glue on the fabric. I'm going to put the glue on the fabric here and then fold that over. Trying to work quickly. The warmer it is outside, the quicker this glue will set up, and sometimes you can only do a part of it, but it's pretty cool temperatures here, so I think I can get it all done. I'm just making sure the edges are good and glued down here. When you read the polyfiber instructions, they say you want at least 1 inch of bonding to the tube and 1 inch of overlap minimum to make sure that things are glued down properly. Now later in the process, when you do the poly brush, it also helps glue the remainder of the fabric to the structure after you've gone through the shrink process. Okay. I'm going to glue this piece and down. We're gonna go ahead and put our glue marks for the hinges. So it makes them easy to cut. And while that dries, we will glue down this tip. Let me change the angle of the camera. I'm not real good at this making video thing, but I hope it's conveying the process okay. Now I'm going to get glue on the inside here, and then we'll fold it over and go all the way to the bottom. Now, if this is pretty tight up in here, so I'm gonna put a little glue right there. But if you have a lot of wrinkling up in this area, don't put a lot of glue here because you're gonna wanna shrink and you're gonna want that fabric to move. As you can see, that's pretty tight, which is really what you want. If you've been careful and tried to keep everything straight, you should have a pretty good, pretty tight right there. Give you a better angle here. Now we're going to cut out these two hinges. A little bit wet. All right, I'm going to mark these hinges. Again, I just feel for the you can see that's about what the mark looks like. And I'll cut that square out of there. Again, a fresh razor blade is your friend. It's really amazing how quickly this fabric dulls these razor blades. Okay. Okay, we're gonna pull that off, put a bead of fabric underneath that, or a bead of glue underneath that, and glue that down, and then we'll turn it over and finish up. I put it in kind of the upper quarter part of the bar here. Now, if the glue dries real quick, it's probably not a good idea to do what I'm doing here, because you won't be able to force it through if the glue underneath is dry, but it's about 65 degrees in the shop here, and the glue dries slow enough that I can get away with this. I think the book recommends you don't try to force any more glue through the weave, because it can weaken could actually weaken the joint. But I guess I have a hard time following instructions. But again, it's still wet, so I can force it through. If it was dry, I wouldn't be able to force it through that weave, and I wouldn't be accomplishing anything. You really want to see the black color come through, which tells you it's saturated all the way through the fabric to the underlying structure. Okay, we're going to let that dry, and then we will turn it over. Okay, the glue has set up well enough to be able to turn this over. Okay. All right, so now this will wrap, and again, that final seam will be on the bottom of the elevator, and this one will be as well. So I'm going to take a pencil and mark these, and just mark them to the edge of the structure. So it should be obvious about where you need to mark it. Just give yourself a good pull on the fabric as you do this, so you get a good straight, even line. Do the best job you can to make it look professional. Lettering is one of those deals where you really want to take your time and do as neat a job as you can, because the job you do here will really have an impact on how the plane looks when you're done. think I am the fastest by any means. But I try to be neat and do a good job. Okay, we'll again apply the glue to that lip here in a moment. Let's go ahead and get this piece cut. Okay, now, just like I did on the other side, I'm going to draw a line. And pull the fabric tight as you do this. There will be a covering tape that goes over this, so, but again, the neater job you do, seems to have a cumulative effect. Now I'm going to cut down that line I drew. Sometimes you get some pieces on the back side there. So now we're going to apply glue to these pieces of fabric here and here and glue them down, and we will be ready to shrink. I'm going to try to change the angle here, see if you can see better. Move that brush across the fabric. I was afraid I would drip some glue. Now on a hot summer day, you probably want to do this in stages, not the whole seam, but at 65 degrees, 70 degrees, you can get away with doing what I'm doing here. And sometimes I got to put just a little bit down the edges to get them to bond good to the fabric. Okay, just need to let that set up now. Also find if there's a little bit of glue there, when you use your iron at 250, it'll help lay that seam down. Okay, that's getting the fabric glued on. We're gonna let that dry, and then we'll start the shrink process. Okay, we've set our iron to 250 degrees. And we're gonna start to tighten up this fabric. This may be a bit tedious, and I don't know how well this will show up in the video. Your final shrink's at 350, but you just want to get everything in position at 250. Well, you can see how that's tightening up right there. It doesn't hurt to leave it sitting there. You want that to reach a full 250. I don't know if you can see in the this will be a long, tedious process, but you can see how it's starting to shrink up. There's some areas that still need to be shrunk more. But you'll go over it at 250 on both sides, and then we'll do the same thing at 350 for the final shrink. And make sure your seam remains on the bottom. You can still move it. That's why we didn't glue there. You can move that seam to get it to where you want it. So this is the first step of the process. Get your fabric glued on. Then there'll be a step where we'll apply the poly brush, which is a pink solution. And there's some tapes that go on here and some rivets that hold the fabric to the ribs. And finally, you're going to spray some silver to protect it from ultraviolet light. I'll show those steps in a later video.